when winning starts to feel more dangerous than obeying. There's a question that never shows up in official papers. It isn't typed into memoranda. It isn't spoken out loud in conference rooms. But it exists, and when it appears, it can bend the course of a war. The question is too simple to be comfortable. What if he's right, even without asking permission? Because asking permission is more than procedure. It's surrendering your timing to a man who isn't there. It's agreeing that decisions made 1,000 miles away should weigh the same as decisions made with men dying all around you. And George Patton began to see something no one in Washington wanted to say out loud. War does not wait for authorization. At first, everything looked normal. Orders came down. Orders were carried out. Reports went back up. But little by little, the field began moving faster than the paperwork. Breakthroughs happened before replies. Openings appeared and died in the space between a request and stand by for instructions. And in that gap, short, quiet, invisible, something is born that's more dangerous than open rebellion. It isn't disobedience. It isn't a public challenge. It's worse. It's practical autonomy. Because when a general stops asking, "May I?" and starts thinking, "If I don't do it now, no one else will," he isn't breaking with command. He's testing the limits of control. And that is exactly the kind of thing a president fears. Franklin D. Roosevelt wasn't afraid of losing a battle. He was afraid of losing something larger. Control of the war, control of the tempo, control of the story. Roosevelt understood something the public rarely understands. The general who threatens democracy isn't the one who challenges orders. It's the one who wins without needing them. Because a defeated general can be punished. A loud general can be removed. But a general who delivers results, without asking permission, forces the political leader into an impossible choice. Stop him, and you own the risk of failure. Let him run, and you accept that, on that stretch of war, the control has already shifted hands. And the most unsettling part, Patton never announced that shift. No speech, no letter. He simply began acting as if the answer was already yes. And when Roosevelt finally saw it, the question was no longer, how do we stop him? The real question, the one that could never be asked in public, was, what is this costing us? And what would it cost to stop him now? That's where this story truly begins. Not with shouting, not with a showdown, but with a dangerous silence. The silence between an order never given and a victory that has already happened. Washington lived in maps. Patton lived in dust. On paper, that difference seems small. In war, it decides everything. To Roosevelt, the war was a global system. Europe, the Pacific, fragile alliances, public opinion, future elections. Every decision had to survive committees, cables, anxious allies, and headlines. To Patton, war was an instant. Move now, or the enemy reorganizes. Cross today, or tomorrow costs 10 times the blood. That's where the mismatch began. Orders arrived too correct, and too late. Patton didn't ignore command out of contempt. He ignored it out of diagnosis. He saw what never showed up cleanly in the reports. The enemy wasn't defeated, he was disordered. And disorder has an expiration date. There's a moment in war, short, fragile, when the enemy is still alive, but doesn't know where he stands. That moment doesn't wait for approval. Patton knew that because he'd seen the other side. He knew what happens when you stop to consolidate. He knew how the enemy uses every pause to turn panic into a line. And Washington wanted exactly that. Pause, consolidation, political alignment. Roosevelt wasn't wrong. He was fighting a different kind of fight. Every advance had to respect logistics, uncomfortable alliances, the constant fear of looking reckless, and the political danger of a visible setback. But Patton didn't see allies. He saw openings. He didn't see treaties. He saw exposed flanks. He didn't see inter-allied coordination. He saw enemy soldiers buying time, and then something dangerous began. Patton stopped asking permission to move. He moved, and informed afterward, not as open rebellion, as a finished fact. We are beyond the expected line. Contact made. exploitation underway. Reports that didn't ask, reports that announced. And every time it worked, something quietly hardened into place. The battlefield was validating Patton before Washington could even challenge him. Roosevelt began to notice it not through mistakes, but through successes. Fast wins, unlikely shifts, enemy collapses where the plan predicted resistance. And that creates the most uncomfortable problem in leadership. When disobedience works, it becomes tempting. Because stopping it now means risking the loss of tempo, explaining to the public a slowdown without a defeat, and justifying why you restrained the one general who was winning. And Roosevelt knew, the public forgives failure. It does not forgive leaders who hold back victory. So instead of an immediate clash, came what always comes before a break. Silence, calculated tolerance, observation. Roosevelt didn't say, stop, but he also didn't say, keep doing it. He let Patton push forward, knowing that every mile gained without explicit permission was also a mile lost of direct political control. And that is the most unstable moment in war, when the field begins to lead and civilian power must decide whether to accept it or cut it off, because accepting changes the whole game. But cutting it off could cost you the war. And Roosevelt was walking straight into that point. The day asking permission started to feel like a mistake. There was no official moment, no torn-up order, no dramatic line like, I won't obey Washington anymore. What happened was something far more dangerous. Time. The war was moving faster than the paperwork. While reports climbed the chain of command, the field had already changed. While maps were being redrawn, the enemy had already pulled back or dug in. Patton saw it before everyone else, and that created a private, quiet, corrosive dilemma. If I wait, I lose the advantage. If I move, I'll have to explain later. At first he still asked. He sent messages. He requested authorization. But replies came too late, or came watered down, cautious, full of conditions. War does not accept conditions. It accepts action, or it accepts emptiness. That's when Patton changed something fundamental. Not the goal, but the order of things. Before, ask, wait, act. After, act, secure it, inform, not as a political challenge, as combat logic. And that changes everything. Because the moment a general begins creating facts on the ground, higher authority stops deciding whether and starts deciding only how to respond. Patton no longer asked permission to create opportunity. When he asked at all, he asked permission to manage consequences, and the field rewarded him. Every unexpected push caught the enemy out of position. Every quick move shattered a German plan still on paper. Every autonomous decision saved American lives, at the cost of nerves in Washington. That created an invisible tension. Roosevelt wasn't dealing with just any undisciplined commander. He was dealing with a man delivering exactly what the president needed politically. Visible progress, victory you could point to, initiative. But he delivered it in a way that slipped past the traditional grip. And the most uncomfortable truth of all, Patton was right for too long. Every time someone in Washington thought, he's gone beyond the agreement, the next report would read, position secured. Enemy resistance collapsed. Operational gains confirmed. The problem stopped being what Patton was doing and became how to stop him without looking reckless. Because here is the truth most leaders hate to face. A general becomes a threat when he fails. While he keeps succeeding, he becomes necessity. Patton wasn't refusing permission because he despised it. He saw it as risk. Risk of losing time. Risk of losing momentum. Risk of turning advantage into stagnation. And by stopping his weight, he crossed an invisible line, from executor to decision-maker. That was the pivot. Not rebellion, but something harder to contain, efficiency off script. And when that happens, civilian power does not strike immediately. It watches, it calculates, it waits to see whether the thing breaks or wins. And Roosevelt was watching everything. Roosevelt saw what few leaders will ever admit out loud. Patton was no longer testing limits. He was setting the tempo of the war. And tempo in combat is real power. This wasn't a string of bold moves anymore. It was a pattern. Whenever Patton accelerated, the enemy broke before he could respond. Whenever central plans hesitated, the field was already solved. Whenever Washington still debated possible scenarios, Patton had already created an irreversible fact. Roosevelt was not naive. He understood the danger perfectly. A general who stops asking permission threatens more than the enemy. He threatens the very idea of civilian command. But one detail changed everything. Patton did not fail. And not failing changes the whole political equation. Because there's a brutal difference between ideological defiance and operational defiance validated by results. Patton wasn't giving speeches against Washington. He wasn't publicly challenging Roosevelt. He wasn't building his own political. He simply arrived first. And every early arrival created a quiet embarrassment. If I stop him now, what exactly do I tell the country? Roosevelt began to understand the war had entered a gray zone. Patton no longer needed explicit permission. He only needed not to be stopped. And that changed the president's role. Roosevelt stopped acting like a man authorizing movements and started acting like a man drawing broad boundaries. Not advance to here, but do not cross this political line. It was an invisible concession, but a deep one, because once Patton stopped asking, he forced Roosevelt into a choice between two evils: reassert control and risk slowing victory, or accept the advance and hope the general did not cross the point of no return. And Roosevelt chose the hardest option for a democratic leader, to trust without fully endorsing. He accepted Patton operating on the edge of autonomy, as long as he did not cross into the realm of politics. That was the unwritten bargain. No memo, no announcement, no headlines, but real. And here's the most uncomfortable part. Roosevelt wasn't being weak. He was being coldly practical. He knew victory had to look orderly, but sometimes it had to be won in disorder at the tactical level. Patton became the instrument that did what the system could not do fast enough. And Roosevelt, fully aware of it, did something rare. He accepted losing micro-control to preserve the macro result. Not because Patton was right about everything, but because in that specific stretch of war, the worst decision would be forcing normal procedure on a battlefield that demanded exception. That is where the title begins to make sense. Roosevelt accepted, quietly, unofficially, and he chose not to pull the brake. Because some victories do not allow bureaucracy, and some commanders do not fit neatly inside democracy, but save it at the exact moment it needs to survive. When control started to matter less than winning, Roosevelt was no innocent. And he was certainly not weak. He understood war, power, vanity, and dangerous men better than almost anyone of his age. And he understood something essential about Patton before he ever admitted it out loud. Patton wasn't an administrative problem. Patton was an operational phenomenon. The White House began receiving two kinds of messages, and they did not match. On one side, cautious memoranda, warnings about excess, notes about unauthorized advances, diplomatic concerns. On the other, maps changing too fast, enemy lines cracking, reports of German collapse, gains nobody planned, but everybody cheered. Roosevelt realized he was facing a choice no handbook teaches: correct the general or absorb the result, because there was a real cost to trying to rein Patton in, not only military, symbolic. To punish Patton in that moment would mean explaining to the public why the general pushing the Germans back had to be restrained, and that creates a dangerous political paradox. Why are we limiting the man who's winning? Roosevelt didn't say that publicly, but he understood it in silence, and he made a decision you rarely see written plainly in books. No direct confrontation, no official endorsement, no interference. He let Patton push forward, without saying he approved. That is a refined kind of power. Not explicit permission. Strategic tolerance. Roosevelt began acting like a man who knows that in extreme times, absolute control is an illusion. So long as the results kept coming, the political chain was not publicly humiliated, and Patton did not cross certain symbolic lines. The president would accept the method without fully accepting the man. Patton felt that, and men like Patton read silence better than orders. He understood. No one was stopping him, no one was defending him, but everyone was benefiting. That is the kind of space where dangerous figures thrive. Because now Patton didn't need to prove he was right. He only needed to keep being right. Roosevelt knew it couldn't last forever. He knew men who stop asking permission rarely walk back on their own. But he also knew something worse. Stopping Patton at that point would cost more than letting him run. So Roosevelt accepted something presidents hate to accept. In that specific stretch of war, the tempo was no longer in Washington. It was in the field, in the dust, in decisions made before anyone could say, wait. It was not surrendering authority. It was suspending it, temporarily. Because Roosevelt didn't need to be obeyed in that moment. He needed to win. And Patton was delivering exactly that, even if he was teaching a dangerous lesson along the way. That results can sometimes speak louder than permission, and once that lesson is learned, it never truly disappears. When winning fast creates a slow problem, every decision that ignores a boundary collects interest later. Roosevelt knew that. Patton knew it too. He simply didn't care. While the lines moved forward and the communiques praised victories, something began piling up behind the curtains of power, an invisible debt of authority. Every time Patton moved without waiting, every time an unauthorized plan worked, every time the enemy collapsed faster than predicted, the precedent grew stronger. And precedents are dangerous because they make no noise when they're born. You only hear them when someone tries to reverse them. Roosevelt began to see an uncomfortable pattern. Patton wasn't just winning battles. He was redefining what was acceptable. Younger officers began to imitate him. Middle commanders started making harder decisions, confident that if it works, no one will question it. And that creates a silent shift of power. Less waiting, less deference, less political caution. The war began to be driven not only by orders, but by expectation of success. The problem was not Patton alone. The problem was what Patton was teaching, without ever saying a word. Roosevelt understood war requires exceptions, but he also understood that repeated exceptions stop being exceptions. They become culture, and culture is harder to contain than any single general. The White House began to feel the side effects. Diplomats complaining that field decisions created unnecessary crises, allies growing uneasy with American unpredictability, British officers seeing Patton as a walking political hazard, memoranda no longer asking if Patton would cross a line, but when. Roosevelt could no longer pretend it was merely style. It was influence. And influence outside formal control is the kind of thing that topples empires or presidents. But there was a cruel trap. Intervene too early, and it looks like you're weakening the war effort. Intervene too late, and it looks like you've lost control. That is the heart of this phase. When do you correct a man who only misbehaves after he's been right too many times? Patton was changing as well. Men who stop asking permission begin to confuse tolerance with approval, silence with agreement, results with immunity. He stopped seeing limits as moral lines and started seeing them as logistical obstacles. That is the point where an efficient commander begins to become a systemic risk. Roosevelt didn't ignore it. He postponed the reckoning. Because at that moment, something mattered more than institutional discipline, ending the war. But by accepting Patton for that long, Roosevelt created something inevitable, a future confrontation. Not about terrain, not about tactics, about who decides when the exception ends. And when that question rises, someone always gets cut. The debt was written, and the war would not be the only place it would be collected. The moment Roosevelt realizes he no longer authorizes, he only reacts. There is a specific instant in any chain of command. When authority is not taken, it simply stops being consulted. It doesn't come with warning. It doesn't come with a public break. It happens quietly when decisions arrive only after they have already been carried out. That is when Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something unsettling. Patton was no longer waiting for political windows. He was creating facts, moves already made, cities already taken, fights already started. And then came the explanation, never the request. No direct challenge, no declared insubordination, just something harder to fight. Irreversible efficiency. How do you reprimand a general when the map proves he was right? How do you enforce restraint when the political cost of slowing him is higher than the risk of letting him run? Roosevelt saw that the problem wasn't Patton disobeying. It was Patton operating at a tempo where permission became irrelevant. Modern war moved too fast for committees, too fast for diplomacy, too fast for consensus, and Patton understood that. He understood, almost instinctively, that speed creates its own authority. The man who arrives first sets the situation. The man who sets the situation forces everyone else to accept it. That was the new game, and Patton played it better than any Allied commander alive. For Roosevelt, it created a dangerous imbalance. The president decided in Washington, Patton decided on the ground, and the ground changed before decisions could arrive. It wasn't rebellion. It was a shift of the center of power. And the most uncomfortable part, Roosevelt began to notice that he himself was adapting to it, accepting reports instead of plans, managing consequences instead of choices, explaining actions he had never authorized. That is the moment civilian authority begins to turn into damage control. Patton didn't see himself as a problem. To him, asking permission was a luxury of slow times, and slow times killed soldiers. He believed, genuinely, that ignoring steps saved lives, saved time, did what had to be done while others hesitated. That conviction made it more dangerous, because men who believe they are right do not feel they need to be restrained. Roosevelt didn't see a traitor. He saw something more complex, a commander who had crossed a psychological point of no return, a man who no longer needed to be authorized, only tolerated. And tolerance in politics is never neutral. It always creates precedent. Here, Roosevelt accepts something quiet and bitter. He was still president, but with Patton, he was no longer the initiator. He had become the late acceptor. The war kept being won, but control was slipping, not through weakness, but through success, moving too fast to slow without paying for it. This is where Roosevelt meets the central truth of the story. Patton didn't just stop asking permission. War made permission obsolete, and Patton saw it first. And when one man sees that first, no one around him stays comfortable for long. This is the ground the reckoning stands on. The day winning is no longer enough. The day the problem stops being military, and the day Roosevelt must decide whether he accepts the man, or tries, too late, to remind him who still holds the final authority. When winning starts to cost more than losing. From that point on, something changed between Roosevelt and Patton. Not in documents, not in written orders, but in the air. Patton's success stopped being simple to celebrate. It began to be measured with caution. Every advance came with questions that would never appear in a public communique. How far will he go if no one checks him? What if the next militarily correct decision is politically catastrophic? Who pays when a general wins too fast? Because Patton didn't just move forward. He moved without asking for diplomatic space. He ignored subtleties. He scorned fragile alliances. He treated the enemy with brutal words and symbols. And cracks began to show, not on the battlefield, in the world outside it. Allies grew uneasy. British command grew irritated. Diplomats began cleaning up language after Patton spoke. War demanded coordination. Patton demanded freedom. Those two rarely lived together for long. Roosevelt saw he had entered an impossible equation. Contain Patton, and you may slow victories. Do not contain him, and you may lose narrative, politics, and moral authority. And control does not vanish in a single stroke, it erodes. First a general becomes a headline, then a symbol, then a reference greater than the civilian command itself. Patton was nearing that edge. The press fed it. The public fed it. The myth grew. And ideas do not obey orders. Roosevelt understood what few grasp in real time. A general does not need to openly defy a president to weaken him. It is enough that the country begins believing more in the general than in the process. Patton, with his contempt for limits, was feeding exactly that. The cruel part is that Patton didn't look wrong. Militarily, it worked. His men followed him. The results came. But a state is not built only on results. It is built on precedent. Roosevelt accepted a bitter truth. It doesn't matter if Patton is right today. It matters what others learn from him tomorrow. If a general can act without permission and be rewarded, then the next war will not be run by civilians. It will be run by whoever wins first. That was the invisible cost, not paid in blood, not paid in defeats, paid in the slow wearing down of authority. And the most dangerous part, you only notice that erosion when it is too late to restore without a fight. Roosevelt wasn't dealing with a rebel. He was dealing with a moving precedent, and precedents once accepted cannot be unaccepted. They only accumulate. This is where Roosevelt realizes accepting Patton without limits was not a temporary wartime bargain. It was a choice that would change the balance between victory and control long after the shooting stopped. The question was no longer whether Patton would win. The question became, who will truly be in command when the war ends? And no map could answer that. Roosevelt never announced the decision he made in that period. It didn't become a speech. It didn't become a public memorandum. It didn't become a famous line. Because what he accepted was not something a man could say out loud. He accepted that in total war, absolute civilian control is an ideal, not a guarantee. He accepted Patton would not go back to asking permission, because men like Patton are not built to ask. They are built to act. And he accepted something even more unsettling, that the system he defended would only survive if it knew when to bend without breaking. Roosevelt did not defeat Patton. He did not fully embrace him either. He did something quieter and more dangerous. He let Patton push forward, knowing that, when the time came, the system itself would have to absorb the blow or neutralize it. Not now, not in public, but inevitably. This is the kind of decision presidents do not celebrate. They carry it. Because Roosevelt knew Patton would not be remembered for the times he asked for clearance. He would be remembered for the times he won before anyone had time to say no. And that created an uneasy legacy. Patton became the symbol of extreme initiative, aggressive command, action without hesitation. But he also became the quiet example of a limit, the exact point where a general grows larger than the structure that made him. Roosevelt accepted Patton because he needed to win the war. But in accepting him, he also accepted that after victory, the country would have to relearn how to separate force from authority. That is the final paradox. Patton won battles because he stopped asking permission. Roosevelt preserved democracy because he knew when not to stop him, and when later it would be necessary to remind everyone who truly commands. The lesson was never about disobedience. It was about responsibility, about understanding that not every victory strengthens the system, not every control produces results, and not every man who wins fast is the man you want leading when the silence comes. Roosevelt accepted Patton not as an eternal model, but as a necessary exception. And exceptions exist so they do not become the rule. This story does not end with applause. It ends with a warning. Every time someone stops asking permission and begins winning on his own, somewhere someone must stay clear-eyed enough to ask, what will this cost after the war is over? And Roosevelt, more than anyone in that moment, understood that price exactly, even knowing no one would ever applaud him for it.